This is Jim Cannell on Today Television. This is Bible Study for the 21st century. So welcome, friends. It's always good to come your way, and I know that you've got lots of things you can do in the day to sit back with your television or your computer or your smartphone and share a few minutes with me. It means a lot to me, and I really appreciate it. I do not take your viewership for granted, not for a moment. And that's why I work hard to make sure that what we add is value as we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and John. We're in Mark. I'll be back with it right after this.
The Bible tells us that true religion is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. The Bible also says that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. Heaven's core values for mankind begin with God's heart for the least of these. When you support WOW, you're in the sweet spot of God's heart for the poor. Yes, we're only a small player in this great drama, but at least we're on the field. Please give generously.
So now, friends, we're coming to a very interesting account of a trap that was set for Jesus. And last time well, let me just read it here. Verse 13 of Mark 12. They sent to him, they being the scribes and Sadducees, some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his word. Now, I talked about the Pharisees last time, the interpreters of the scripture. Now you got the Herodians. Who are they? The Herodians were a mix of secular and religious people who had essentially acquiesced to Roman rule, who at least gave lip service to the Roman king is too strong a word, although the Herods, there were several of them, were referred to as kings. But they were, in other terms, they were referred to as the Hellenistic Jews, Hellenistic, Hellenistic, referring to the Greek culture that had pervaded the world since Alexander the Great's conquests. And so secularism and Hellenism were essentially equivalent terms. Then to politically embrace the occupation of Rome in Judea, one became known as a Herodian. And so the interests of the state were now a core value before the interests of the temple, before the interests of the prophets of Israel, before the interests of the rabbis, even while many of them would still be attending, synagogue and coming to the temple and in every way purporting to be God-fearing Jews, okay? But they're coming to catch Jesus in his words, all right? They want to trap him. So they start out by flattering Jesus. Teacher, verse 14, we know that you are true and care about no one, for you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth. Now, but care about no one is one way of interpreting it. In the original language, it might be better to say, and are a man of integrity, meaning that regardless of what people say, you do what your heart tells you to say. That would be their understanding of integrity, okay? You teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay? Now, the people of that region, under the rule of Rome at that time, were required to pay Roman taxes. Now, they were not onerous, but every individual had to pay what was known as a poll tax once a year. And it was for the emperor's treasury, and it amounted to 1 denarius per year. Not a lot of money, but, you know, significant. But it was what it symbolized, really, that was the kicker. It symbolized subjection. In paying the poll tax to Rome, you're basically saying, I am subject to Rome. And this, of course, was greatly humiliating for many, and it stuck in their throat to even admit that Caesar was in charge. But they did it because at one point, previous to this, Caesar had actually demanded a yearly sacrifice in his honor. And that had really stuck on the throat of the Jews for sure. But what's happening here is they're testing Jesus' zealotry. Now, a zealot in those times would be known in our day as an insurgent, maybe even as a terrorist. They were a hyper-nationalist. They wanted Rome out, and in many cases they went to extreme measures to try to get them out. There were various little secretive, you know, groups of zealots, led usually by charismatic leaders, who to a greater or lesser degree would become activists, some even to the point of violence, many of whom would be crucified by the Romans for subversion of the state. They were merciless with zealots. But the disciples were very nationalistic. They fully expected that Jesus was going to establish the throne in Jerusalem, and he was going to rout the Romans, and then he was going to rule the world from Jerusalem, and they wanted to be his cabinet. And it really, when you follow the story in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you see it again and again, how the disciples just didn't understand really what Jesus was about. They were intrigued and absolutely blown away by his miraculous power and by his powerful teaching, but they always had an agenda. They even argued at one point who was the greatest. Another time, James and John had their mother come and lobby with Jesus to see if he had put one of her sons at the right hand, one at the left hand when he established his throne in Jerusalem. These guys, you know, had a political agenda. And so in interacting with the disciples, a lot of the religious authorities would just assume that they were parroting Jesus' words. They were saying what Jesus had taught them. And of course, they weren't, but that's how it was seen. And so what they're doing here is they're testing Jesus to see how zealous he is. In asking him the question, do we or do we not pay the poll tax to Caesar, they're putting him in a real box, because if he approved the tax, he would lose the people because the people all bitterly resented it. If he disapproved, he risked immediate arrest for subversion and non-compliance with the Roman authorities. Jesus' answer is brilliant. Okay, bring me a coin. They bring him a denarius. Whose picture is this? Caesar's. Oh. Give to Caesar what's Caesar. Give to God what's God's. What can you do with that? Brilliant. Mark says he knew their hypocrisy. Even while they're flattering him, he knew that they were trying to trap him, and he knew that there was an agenda there. So he says, why do you test me? You know, bring me that denarius. They marvel at him, Mark says, and in verse 17. And so they basically, I think, slunk away. No, he doesn't say that. Mark, in his history of Jesus' life and ministry, gives a lot of account, but not a lot of detail. And he will, you know, move from one story to the next, sometimes without a transition sentence, without any reference to what happened just a moment ago or yesterday. He just kind of moves on. And that's what's going to happen here. Okay, so verse 18 through 27. We're going to have Jesus faced with another tricky question, this one from the Sadducees. Some Sadducees, verse 18, who say there is no resurrection, came to him. They asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote to us that if a man's brother dies and leaves his wife behind and leaves no children, his brother should take his wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first took a wife, and dying he left no offspring. Second took her, he died, nor did he leave any offspring. The third likewise. So the 7 had her and left no offspring. Last of all, the woman died. Therefore, in the resurrection, when they rise, whose wife will she be? For all 7 of her had her as wife. Now, let's just stop there before we pick it up in verse 24. The Sadducees, the temple elite, did not believe in resurrection. The Pharisees did, Sadducees didn't. You see, the Sadducees only followed the teaching of the first 5 books of the Bible. And there's no reference there to resurrection directly. And so they developed a theology that did not include resurrection. The Pharisees, on the other hand, they did. But here they come with a trick question that is theological. Not believing in resurrection, they tell this story, this, hypothetical, about a woman who has 7 husbands. Now, what they're referring to here is what's known as the Levirate Law. It was a great tragedy for a man to die and leave no son to carry on his name and his legacy. And it was culturally such a core value that if a man died not having had his wife bear a son, his brother was to marry his widow and sleep with her, and hopefully she would have a son. And if she did, that son would bear the departed father's name. This was a way of continuing his legacy. This is called levirate marriage. And that's what's going on here when they say Moses wrote about this. So this happens again and again and again. Eventually, after 7 husbands, all brothers, not having produced a son, she dies. And so the question is, in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? I mean, really. Jesus says, are you not therefore mistaken? You don't know the scriptures nor the power of God. For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, very like angels in heaven. But concerning the dead that they rise, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the burning bush passage, how God spoke to him saying, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Now, this is a very, very clever response, and I'm out of time for this segment, so I'm going to leave it there, and I'll take a little break, and then after the break, I will come back and we'll deal with this, because Jesus' answers to tricky questions are worth a study in themselves. And I'll be back with that right after this.
Why dance when you have very little? When you live from day to day with food insecurity, rampant disease, sickness, and death, you dance because your heart is full of love for God and your hope is strong. WOW has come alongside as the hands and feet of the Lord, providing both home-based care and assurance of God's love. You're happy and you've got to dance. Please support WOW. Let's keep them dancing.
So in responding to this trick question, this trick theological question from the Sadducees, trying to trap Jesus in some kind of confusion about resurrection, they ran into a brilliant response. He said, look, At the burning bush, when God revealed himself, or at least his name, in that bush that was not consumed but was on fire, to Moses in the wilderness, when he referred to himself as Yahweh, in the basic Hebrew, it basically means I will be who or what I will be. And don't try to describe me any more in detail than that. Pardon me. He said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. With the implication that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had died, are still alive. What? They're still alive in the presence of God. There is this place called heaven, you know. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. You are therefore greatly mistaken, Mr. Sadducee, not believing in resurrection. You know, this is profound. He's accusing these temple elite, the Sadducees, the ones who controlled the temple, the ones from whom the entire priestly leadership of Israel and Judah came from. He's accusing them essentially of biblical illiteracy. They certainly didn't get the scripture. He's accusing them of ignorance. Now, if you can just sort of think about this for a minute. Imagine if Jesus were on the scene in the flesh right now, and he was in the presence of some of the main church leaders of the world, and there was some kind of theological dispute going on. I won't suggest what it might be about, but in the midst of it, Jesus says, excuse me, hold on, fellas, hold on. You're all biblically illiterate. Would there be pushback? I think so. Well, that's what's going on here. You're not only biblically illiterate, but you are ignorant of God's power, of his capacities that eclipse subcultural theologies. Because essentially, their refusal to believe in resurrection was more subcultural than it was anything else. It pleased their culture. It was consistent with their comfort zone to not believe in resurrection, because to believe in resurrection by extension means to believe in accountability. To be accountable on the other side for the choices you make on this side. Resurrection has that implication. I mean, we talk about it, you know, the glories of resurrection, the glories of being in the presence of God forever and ever. Yeah, all good, but there's also an account that must be given. And there's also a judgment that must be made. And that's why the day of the Lord is referred to as a day of judgment. It's coming. It's not here yet, but it's coming. And for those who pass muster, they will hear the Lord say, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. But for those who have not done well, there will be rejection, to be forever cast out into eternal separation from God, which to me is the most horrific component of what the Bible refers to as hell. He says, look, fellas, there's no marriage in heaven. There's no husbands and wives in heaven. When you get to the other side, you're going to be like the angels. There's no need for procreation. Procreation is there to multiply, to populate the earth. And that's a space-time concern. In the eternities, that is not a concern. There's no need for that. There's not going to be any husband. There's not going to be any wife. There's not going to be any marriage. And what's more, you say there's no resurrection. Well, how is it then that there's reference by God himself in the burning bush to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are still alive? God is God of the living, all right? So he says to them, you guys are quite wrong. And they slunk away. Now, this introduces a conversation that Jesus had with a young scribe. And I'm going to start it here, but I won't finish it here. I'll have to finish it next program. It's absolutely critical that I take time with this, because as I see it, what's about to come from the mouth of Jesus here captures the very essence of Old Testament prophecy. Old Testament prophecy is about the future, yes, but it's also about the present. It is foretelling, but it's also forthtelling. It sees, but it also sees, future and present. And when you analyze the prophetic component in the Old Testament, you see again and again, I haven't done it statistically, but prophecy is at least 50-50, if not 60-40, forthtelling, foretelling. Interestingly, the foretelling component often refers to Israel's coming Messiah. And some of the most brilliant passages of the Old Testament, especially from the book of Isaiah, refer to that servant of the Lord who is coming. And it's an amazing study. It really is when you get into it. But in the Old Testament context, prophecy as forthtelling, 9 times out of 10, addresses idolatry and or wayward faith, where the people of God fall away from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they begin to worship idols. They begin to worship foreign gods. There's all kinds of talk as you go through the Old Testament of sacred poles and shrines on the high places and statues and idols to fertility goddesses and goat gods and cow gods. And some of them erected right in the temple precincts itself. A total abomination as far as God's concerned. And so, you know, he anoints prophets to address these things directly. And the prophet always is unpopular, because not only is he addressing the idolatry of the people, but he's also addressing the culture that accompanies the idolatry. Culture always accompanies religion. It always does. And they were not just ignored, they were in most cases abused and sometimes even killed. But their essential message was that the people of God should return to a right relationship with him and a right relationship with neighbor. And the vertical relationship was described in terms of righteousness. The horizontal relationship was described in terms of justice. Now, the word in Hebrew for righteousness is zadkah. In modern Hebrew, if I say to a man, you're right, I say atazodek. To a woman, I say atzodeket. A holy man is called a tzaddik. In Hebrew, you write right to left. There are no vowels. It's a very parsimonious language, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 words used, you know, in modern Hebrew today. And the 3 Hebrew letters used for righteousness are Z or Z, depending on whether you're a Canadian or American, DK, Zadkah, Zedek, Zadik, okay? The word for justice is mishpat. But there are many times when the word Zadkah is translated righteousness and it's also translated justice, depending on the context. So Zadkah is kind of interchangeable. Mishpat usually relates to justice exclusively. The prophets, in forthtelling, in speaking the word of God to the current situation, called Israel back to right relationship with God and right relationship with neighbor. Right? So this was an absolutely critical prophetic core value that had centuries of history and momentum behind it. And this was not lost on Jesus. Jesus was fully aware of this. And in the next teaching segment, I'm going to read what happens here in Mark chapter 12. But it's important that we keep this sort of background in mind as we read it. There was far more to Jewish faith than the 613 laws of Moses, or the oral tradition of the rabbis, or the interpretation of the Pharisees, or the legal judgments of the scribes, or the priestly ministrations of the Sadducees. Righteousness and justice, ultimately, was the bottom line to understanding the way of the Lord, as the Lord himself describes it in Genesis chapter 18. I'll get back to more of this right after this.
WOW works with local churches in needy countries. We mobilize those churches, pastors, and volunteers in a concerted effort to care for orphans and widows in their homes and villages. Through that strong faith-based platform, we're able to not only provide food, medicine, and crisis intervention, but we're also able to lead these afflicted ones to faith in God. It's powerful, humbling, and well worth the effort. Please support WOW with your generous gifts and faithful prayer. Thank you.
I'm sorry to keep you hanging when it comes to this critical conversation Jesus is about to have with a young scribe vis-a-vis righteousness and justice, but you'll have to wait until the next program for me to give it, full treatment. I'll probably take two teaching segments to do that. We'll see how it goes. But remember, friends, that we come your way through the grace of God and through the faithful support of people like you. I'm not deep-pocketed, you aren't either, but together we can dig and find that which will keep a program like this on the air. And so I'm not in any way apologizing. I'm just simply saying thank you for your gifts. Thank you for supporting JCT. Thank you for supporting Working for Orphans and Widows. JCT is the official voice of WOW. And so with JCT and WOW, we're trying to fulfill the call to righteousness and justice. Love for God and love for neighbor. See you next time.